7 months. That's all our American dream lasted. 7 months after selling our house in Ahmedabad, my wife's wedding jewelry, and nearly everything we owned, we were sitting on a plane back to India with almost no money left, no home to return to, and no idea how we were going to rebuild our lives. The most painful part wasn't being deported. It was realizing that we had destroyed a stable life to chase a dream that was never what we thought it would be. When we boarded that flight to Houston, we truly believed we were leaving behind an ordinary life to build something extraordinary. I had done the research. I had run the numbers. I had a plan. I was convinced it would work. But within the first month, everything started to unravel. My wife ended up supporting both of us on her own. Our savings disappeared much faster than we expected, and a problem I had ignored from the very beginning quietly grew until it changed everything. What happened over the next few months didn't just destroy our American dream. It nearly destroyed our financial stability, our future, and everything we had spent years building together. My name is Rakesh Patel, and this is the story of how I convinced my wife to sell everything we owned so we could move to the United States, and why we came back home regretting that decision more than anything else. There is a moment in life when you convince yourself that leaving everything behind is actually the bravest thing you can ever do. I was standing in the middle of our living room in Naroda, a neighborhood on the eastern edge of Ahmedabad, looking at the bare walls where our family photos used to hang. The movers had already taken most of the furniture. The house smelled like dust and empty space. Mira was standing near the window, her arms crossed over her chest, watching the street below as if she were memorizing it. Neither of us said anything for a long time. That silence said everything. My name is Rakesh Patel. I was 38 years old when I made the decision that would unravel the life I had spent nearly 4 decades building. I worked at my family's small auto parts shop, a place my father had opened before I was born, with a rusted metal sign above the door and engine grease permanently embedded in the countertops. I knew every supplier, every regular customer, every shortcut through the back roads to get spare parts delivered on time. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was mine. It was familiar in the way only something truly yours can be. Mira was 35. She had been tutoring children in English from our home for years. Little ones from the neighborhood who would sit at our kitchen table with their notebooks open while she explained grammar and pronunciation with more patience than I could ever manage. She had a gift for it. Parents trusted her. Children looked forward to her lessons. Some of them had been coming to her since they were 6 years old. Our life was not wealthy. We did not take vacations to hill stations or eat at expensive restaurants on weekends. But we had our 2-bedroom house, which we owned outright. We had our routines, our neighbors, our small savings account that we added to carefully every month. We had what most people would call a stable life. The problem with a stable life, I have since learned, is that it is very easy to convince yourself it is not enough. The stories started reaching us gradually, the way rumors always do, not all at once but in pieces, from different directions, building into something that felt undeniable. A cousin of a friend who had moved to New Jersey and was now sending money home every month. A man from our old colony who had gone to Texas and come back for a visit wearing new clothes and speaking English with an American accent. WhatsApp messages full of photographs. Clean apartments, wide roads, grocery stores the size of airplane hangars, cars parked in driveways. Everyone who had gone seemed to be doing well. More than well. They seemed transformed. I started paying attention to every detail. I asked questions. I searched online late at night after Mira had gone to sleep. I watched videos of Indian families sharing their experiences in Houston, in Chicago, in Atlanta. The comments were full of people saying things like, "The opportunities are real, and once you get there, everything changes and don't be afraid. Just go." I was not a reckless man. I want to make that clear. Before I ever mentioned any of it to Mira, I spent almost 8 months reading, calculating, asking around, and trying to understand what the real picture looked like. I built a budget on paper. I estimated the cost of a flight, the cost of the first few months of rent, groceries, transportation. I looked at what kinds of jobs were available for someone with my experience in auto parts and logistics. The numbers were not perfect, but they seemed workable, enough to justify taking the leap. When I finally sat down with Mira and laid it all out, she listened without interrupting. She asked careful questions. She was not immediately excited. That was not her nature. But she was not closed to the idea either. She was honest with me in the way only someone who truly loves you can be. She said, "Rakesh, if we are going to do this, we have to be completely sure, because once we sell the house, There is no going back easily. I told her I understood. I told her I had thought it through. I told her I believed we could make it work. Looking back, I think I believed it because I needed to believe it. Because the alternative, accepting that our life in Naroda was already as good as it was going to get, felt unbearable to me at 38. We spent the next 3 months preparing. Selling the house was the hardest part, not emotionally at first, but logistically. The market in our area was not ideal, and we had to accept less than what we had hoped for. The final amount, after fees and some small debts we settled before leaving, gave us enough to fund the journey and cover roughly 4 to 5 months of basic expenses once we arrived. We told ourselves it would be enough time to get established. Mira's wedding jewelry was the next thing to go. She packed it herself, the gold bangles her mother had given her, the necklace from our wedding day, 2 pairs of earrings she had never worn but kept as an emergency fund. She handed the bag to the jeweler without flinching. I watched her face the whole time. She did not cry. She just nodded when the transaction was done and said, "Okay, it's done." I admired her more in that moment than I can describe. My motorcycle, which I had owned for 11 years and maintained like a second child, sold within a day to a young man in the neighborhood. He came to look at it and paid cash on the spot. I handed him the keys and watched him ride it down the street and around the corner until I couldn't see it anymore. I stood there on the pavement for longer than I should have. We sold some furniture, packed 2 large suitcases each, and stored a few boxes of personal items with Mira's older sister in Vadodara. We said our goodbyes over several days, first to my parents, who were supportive but quiet in the way parents are when they are frightened for their children and trying not to show it, then to Mira's family, then to neighbors, to friends, to the families of the children Mira had been tutoring. One little girl, 7 years old, brought Mira a drawing she had made of the 2 of them sitting at a table. Mira folded it carefully and put it in her carry-on bag. Our flight left early on a Thursday morning in late August. We took a domestic connection from Ahmedabad to Mumbai, then a long international flight to Houston's George Bush Intercontinental Airport. I had never been on a flight that long in my life. Mira slept for several hours. I couldn't sleep at all. I sat with the window shade up for most of the night, watching the darkness over the ocean and going over everything in my head, the budget, the contacts I had made, the address of the apartment where we would be staying for the first few weeks. I told myself, over and over, that we had made the right decision. We landed in the early afternoon on a day so hot and humid that the air outside the terminal felt like walking into a wall. Everything was big. The roads, the cars, the distances between buildings. A man named Vikram, a distant acquaintance of a cousin's colleague, picked us up and drove us to his apartment on the southwest side of Houston. He was friendly and generous, but had warned us in advance that space was limited. When we arrived, we understood what that meant. His apartment had 2 bedrooms. In them lived Vikram, his wife, their 2 young children, and another couple from Gujarat who had arrived a few weeks before us. 8 people in a 2-bedroom apartment. Mira and I were given one corner of the second bedroom, separated from the other couple by a curtain hung from a rod wedged between the walls. Our suitcases were stacked along the wall. We shared one bathroom with everyone else. That first night, lying on a thin mattress on the floor while traffic hummed outside the window, and someone's child cried softly in the next room, I stared at the ceiling and thought about our house in Naroda. The bare walls before the movers came, the empty smell of it. Mira reached over in the dark and took my hand. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. But something in me already knew, in the way you know things you're not ready to admit, that the distance between the dream I had built in my head and the reality I was lying inside was much, much wider than I had ever allowed myself to imagine. I've heard people say that the first week in a new country is the hardest, that after you adjust, things get easier, that the shock fades and you find your footing. I held on to that idea during those first days in Houston like it was a rope thrown to a drowning man. I told myself every morning that the discomfort was temporary, that we were in the difficult part, the part that comes before things get better. But the first week did not feel like adjustment. It felt like collision. Everything moved faster than I expected and slower than I needed. The city itself was disorienting in a way I had not anticipated. Ahmedabad has chaos, but it is a familiar chaos. You learn its rhythms, its shortcuts, its logic over years of living inside it. Houston had a different kind of scale entirely. It was not a city you could walk. It was not even a city you could fully understand from the inside of a car. unless you had been there long enough to recognize the patterns. Roads stretched for kilometers with no shade, no sidewalks, no corner shops. Everything required a vehicle. Everything required knowing someone who had a vehicle. We had neither. Vikram was helpful when he could be, but he worked long hours and had his own family to manage. The other couple sharing the apartment, Dinesh and his wife Kavita, had arrived 3 weeks ahead of us and were already deep in their own struggle to find stable work. We were all polite with each other, careful in the way people are when they are living too close together and trying not to cause friction. We took turns in the kitchen, kept our belongings organized in our small corner of the room, and spoke in low voices after 10 at night. Mira adapted to the physical reality of the apartment faster than I did. She is practical by nature, the kind of person who, when faced with a difficult situation, immediately starts looking for what can be done rather than mourning what cannot. Within 2 days, she had reorganized our corner of the room so it felt slightly less chaotic. She learned the bus routes near the apartment, identified the nearest Indian grocery store, and introduced herself properly to Vikram's wife, whose name was Sonal. The two of them began sharing cooking duties in the evenings, which helped with both the cost of food and the tension of sharing a small space. I spent those first days making calls and sending messages. I had a short list of contacts, names given to me by people back in Ahmedabad who had connections in Houston, a man who worked in warehouse logistics, a man who did subcontracting for construction projects, an acquaintance who had mentioned something vague about opportunities in automotive maintenance. I reached out to all of them. Some replied slowly. Some did not reply at all. On the 5th day, I got a response from the construction contact. His name was Harpal, a Punjabi man in his mid-40s who had been in Houston for nearly 12 years and now worked as a mid-level supervisor on residential construction projects scattered across the outer edges of the city. He told me there was work available, that it paid in cash at the end of each week, and that I should come to a site the following Monday morning at 6:30. I said yes immediately. I did not ask enough questions. That was my first real mistake in Houston. Not the last, but perhaps the most consequential one in those early days. I did not ask how I would get there. I did not ask what the schedule looked like week to week. I assumed that the details would sort themselves out the way details sometimes do when you are optimistic and moving quickly. The site was in a suburb called Katy, nearly 55 kilometers from the apartment. Harpal connected me with 2 other workers who lived on the same side of the city and agreed to pick me up on their way. The first Monday, it worked. They arrived at 6. I climbed into the back seat with my work gloves and a bottle of water, and we drove out through the highway while the sun was still low and orange above the flat horizon. The work itself was physically demanding in a way I had not done since I was a young man helping with construction projects in my uncle's neighborhood, carrying materials, moving equipment, preparing surfaces, working in the direct August sun without much shade. My hands blistered in the first 3 days. My back ached every night, but I did not complain. I was grateful to be earning. I came home each evening, ate whatever Mira had prepared, and fell asleep quickly. The problem was the transportation. It was never fully reliable. The 2 men who gave me rides had their own schedules, their own complications. One of them, a man named Suresh, had a wife who sometimes needed the car for medical appointments. The other, whose name I never learned to pronounce correctly, sometimes picked up additional morning work that changed his route entirely. By the 2nd week, I had already missed 1 full day because neither of them could take me, and I had no other way to reach Katy on time by public transit. The buses did not connect properly, and a rideshare for that distance cost more than I would have earned in a half shift. Harpal was understanding the first time, less so the second. By the 3rd week, I had arrived late on 4 separate occasions and missed 2 full days. He called me on a Wednesday evening and told me, not unkindly but very directly, that he could not keep the position open for someone whose attendance was unreliable. He said if my transportation situation changed, I could call him again. I sat on the floor of the apartment after that call with my phone in my lap for a long time. Around me, life continued in its small enclosed way. Sonal was cooking something fragrant in the kitchen. One of Vikram's children was watching a cartoon on a tablet. Dinesh was talking quietly on the phone in the corner. Mira came and sat beside me. I told her what had happened. She nodded slowly and said, "Okay, we will figure it out." But I could hear something underneath those words. Not defeat. Mira was never someone who collapsed into defeat, but a careful, measured acknowledgement that things were not going the way we had planned. It was during that period, the second half of our first month, that I understood for the first time the specific weight of being financially dependent on your spouse while you are already far from home. Mira had found work at a motel near the airport, a mid-sized property that housed airline crews and budget travelers. She cleaned rooms, she changed sheets, scrubbed bathrooms, vacuumed carpets, restocked toiletries. She left the apartment before 5 in the morning to catch 2 buses and arrived at work before the first guests checked out. She came home in the late afternoon with her feet aching and her uniform smelling of cleaning products. She never complained about the work itself. What she mentioned, only once very quietly, was the way some guests left rooms, as though the person who would clean up after them was not fully a person at all. She said it without bitterness, more as an observation, but I heard it, and it stayed with me. Her income was the only thing keeping us from depleting our savings entirely in that first month. I contributed nothing during those 3 weeks. Every evening when she came home and we sat together to eat, I felt the weight of that fact pressing down on me like something physical. I had been the one who had convinced her to come here. I had built the budget, made the calculations, spoken with the confidence of a man who believed he understood what he was walking into. I had not understood anything. I started applying everywhere I could reach without a car. Restaurants, warehouses, cleaning companies that had shuttle services for workers, any business within a distance that public transit could manage. I applied online. I walked into places directly when Mira could take a day off and accompany me so we could navigate the routes together. I rewrote my experience in terms I hoped would translate to American employers: auto parts, inventory management, logistics, customer coordination. Most places did not call back. A few did, but the wages were very low and the hours conflicting. One promising call from a logistics company ended when they asked about my work authorization status, and I had to explain our situation honestly. By the end of the first month, we had spent nearly a third of our total savings. The math that had seemed workable back in Ahmedabad was already failing, and we had not yet paid rent for our small curtained corner. Vikram had been patient, but that could not continue indefinitely. I lay awake many nights during that period running numbers in my head that never quite balanced. Mira would be asleep beside me, her breathing steady, and I would stare at the ceiling and think about the bare walls of our house in Naroda before the movers came. The house we no longer owned. The life we had dismantled with our own hands because we believed something better was waiting for us on the other side of the world. The worst part was not the money. The worst part was the silence between Mira and me that had slowly grown wider than either of us wanted to admit. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with physical tiredness. It is the exhaustion that comes from pretending, every single day, that you are holding things together when you are not. From performing confidence for the people around you because you are afraid that if you stop, everything will collapse at once. I knew that exhaustion well by the time our second month in Houston began. I wore it every morning when I got up and every night when I lay down. It became as familiar to me as my own reflection. The landscaping job came through a man named Bharat, who attended the same informal gathering of Indian workers that Dinesh had been going to on Sunday afternoons in a church parking lot not far from the apartment. It was not an organized event, just a loose collection of men, mostly from Gujarat and Rajasthan, who gathered to share information about available work, warn each other about employers who did not pay properly, and speak in their own languages for an hour or two without having to think about translation. Dinesh brought me along one Sunday, and within 2 weeks I had a connection that led to a position with a landscaping company operating out of the northwest side of the city. The company was owned by a man from El Salvador who had built it over 15 years into a mid-sized operation, with several crews working across different Houston suburbs. He did not ask many questions. He needed workers who could show up consistently, follow instructions, and handle the physical demands of the job without complaint. I told him I could do all 3 things. He told me the pay, the schedule, and the pickup location where the crew van collected workers each morning. I agreed to everything on the spot. For the first time since arriving in Houston, I had reliable transportation to work. The van picked up workers at 5:45 every morning from a gas station parking lot, 12 minutes from the apartment by bus. It was still early, still dark, still requiring me to leave before Mira woke up most mornings. But it was consistent. It was mine. The work was harder on my body than the construction site had been in a different way. Construction work is intense, but broken into phases. You push hard, then you wait while something is measured or dried or inspected. Landscaping is relentless. You move from one property to the next all day without stopping. Mowing, edging, trimming hedges, blowing debris, loading equipment, unloading equipment, driving to the next address, starting again. In the Houston heat of early autumn, which felt nothing like autumn to me, the hours between 10 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon were nearly unbearable. I drank water constantly and still felt dehydrated by midday. 2 men on the crew had been doing this for years and seemed unaffected by the temperature. I watched them and tried to match their pace. I never fully managed it, but I earned. Every Friday, the crew supervisor handed out envelopes, and every Friday I folded mine carefully and brought it home to Mira. The amounts were not large. Some weeks the hours were shorter due to rain or canceled jobs, and the envelope was thinner than expected. But it was consistent income, and after the silence of that first month, it felt enormously important to be contributing again. Mira was still working at the motel. We had developed a rhythm of sorts. She left before me most mornings. I came home before her most evenings, and we ate together late and talked about the small details of the day before the exhaustion pulled us toward sleep. We did not talk often about the larger things. The question of what came next. The question of whether this was working. Those conversations required an energy neither of us had by the time night arrived. What we did talk about, carefully and in pieces, was money. We kept a simple notebook where we tracked every expense and every dollar that came in. Mira had started it during the first week, in her precise handwriting, with columns and totals at the bottom of each page. Looking at that notebook together in the evenings became a ritual. It kept us honest about where we stood, and where we stood, even with both of us working, was not far enough ahead. The rent we paid Vikram for our corner of the apartment was modest by Houston standards, but still significant relative to what we earned. Food, transportation, phone bills, the occasional unexpected expense, it all accumulated. We were not falling further behind every month, but we were not gaining ground either. We were running in place on a surface that kept shifting slightly beneath our feet. It was during the 3rd month that Mira began to show signs of the strain she had been absorbing quietly. She started losing weight. Not dramatically, but noticeably. She slept poorly. Some evenings she came home from the motel and sat on the edge of the mattress for several minutes without saying anything before she could begin to move through the rest of the evening. I asked her more than once how she was feeling. She always said she was fine, that she was just tired, that things would get better. One evening I came home to find her sitting at the small table we had positioned in our corner of the room, writing a letter by hand on paper she had bought at a dollar store. She was writing to her older sister in Vadodara. I did not read over her shoulder, but I sat near her while she finished. And when she sealed the envelope, she looked at me for a moment with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not sadness exactly, more like a kind of clear-eyed reckoning, as if she had been carrying something for a long time and had finally set it down long enough to look at it honestly. She said, "Rakesh, I don't regret coming here with you, but I think I am starting to understand what we gave up." I did not know what to say. I reached across the table and held her hand and said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say. Outside our curtain, the apartment continued its noise, Vikram's children playing, Sonal speaking on the phone, the television murmuring in the background, the ordinary sounds of other people's lives moving forward. And inside our small curtained corner, Mira and I sat together with the space between what we had imagined and what we were living pressing against us from all sides. I started looking into our immigration situation more seriously during that period. I want to be honest about this part of the story because it matters. We had come to the United States on visitor visas, a legal entry, properly documented. But visitor visas have conditions and time limits, and working while on a visitor visa is not permitted. We had been working since shortly after we arrived. I had known this was a complication, but in the beginning, I had told myself we would find a path, a sponsorship, an adjustment, some legal route that would formalize our situation before it became a problem. I had not found that path. The months had moved faster than I anticipated, and the legal questions had stayed on a list of things I would deal with later. In the meantime, we had both been working, both been visible, both been connected to an employer network that was more exposed than I had fully understood. A man in Bharat's Sunday gathering had been approached by immigration enforcement officers at his workplace 3 weeks before. He told the group what had happened, calmly, as a warning, not as a complaint. Several people in the group quietly stopped attending after that. Dinesh mentioned to me that another Indian family he knew had received a notice to appear. The mood in the apartment shifted. Vikram became more cautious, spoke in lower voices about practical matters, suggested that everyone be careful about routines and visibility. I began to feel a constant low-level alertness that never fully switched off. At work, on the bus, in the parking lot of the grocery store. A vigilance that was different from ordinary caution. It was the vigilance of someone who understands, for the first time with full clarity, that the ground they are standing on has no legal guarantee beneath it. I did not tell Mira the full extent of what I was thinking during those weeks. I shared the general concern. She was not naive, she understood our situation, but I kept the specific weight of my anxiety to myself, which was its own kind of mistake. We were carrying the same fear in separate silences, each trying to protect the other from the full size of it. Looking back, I think that was the period when the dream finally completed its transformation into something else. It did not happen suddenly. It happened the way light fades at the end of a long day, gradually. Then all at once until you look up and realize it has been dark for a while, and you cannot say exactly when it changed. We were still here. We were still trying. But something had quietly ended, and what was coming next would make everything before it feel, by comparison, almost manageable. There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after, not the dramatic moments you expect, not the arguments, not the difficult conversations, not the nights when you lie awake running numbers that don't balance. The real dividing moments are often quieter than you imagine. They arrive without announcement, and by the time you understand what is happening, the before is already gone. Our before ended on a Tuesday morning in late March. I had left for work at the usual time, climbed into the crew van at the gas station parking lot, and was somewhere on the northwest side of the city, trimming hedges along the driveway of a large house in a quiet suburb when my phone rang. It was Mira. She never called during work hours. We had an unspoken agreement that daytime calls meant something was wrong. I stepped away from the crew and answered. Her voice was steady. That was the first thing I noticed. Mira had the kind of steadiness under pressure that I had always admired, and occasionally found frightening, because it meant she was managing something serious enough to require it. She told me quietly that 2 officers had come to the motel, that they had asked to speak with several workers, that she had been asked to show her documentation, that she was currently being asked to wait in a room while additional verification was conducted. I told her I was coming. She told me not to come to the motel, that it would not help and might make things worse. She told me to go to Vikram's apartment and wait, and that she would call me as soon as she knew more. Her voice did not shake once during the entire conversation. I stood on the lawn of that suburban house in the morning sun with my phone in my hand for a long time after she hung up. The rest of the crew continued working around me. Someone called my name and asked if everything was okay. I said yes, put my phone in my pocket, and went back to work because I did not know what else to do with my hands. By midday, Mira had called again. She told me, still in that careful, steady voice, that she and 2 other workers had been formally detained and were being processed. She gave me the name of a facility. She told me not to panic. She told me she loved me. And then the call ended. I left the work site. The supervisor tried to talk to me, and I think I said something to him, but I cannot remember what. I took a bus back toward the apartment, then another bus, sitting in the back with my work gloves still on my hands because I had forgotten to take them off. The city moved past the windows in its enormous, indifferent way. Wide roads, parking lots, strip malls. Everything that had seemed full of possibility 7 months ago now looked like a backdrop, flat and constructed, and belonging to someone else entirely. When I arrived back at the apartment, Vikram was already home. Word had traveled through the network faster than I had. He sat with me at the kitchen table while Sonal made tea that neither of us drank. He had been through his own immigration difficulties years earlier, and spoke with the practical knowledge of someone who understood the system from the inside. He explained what the process likely looked like from here. He named a legal aid organization that helped immigrants in documentation proceedings. He made calls on my behalf to people he knew. I listened to everything he said. I absorbed the information carefully. And underneath all of it, I was thinking about Mira sitting in a facility somewhere on the other side of this enormous city, still being steady, still managing, still protecting me from the full weight of her fear. The following days moved in a way that was both very fast and very slow. There were forms, appointments, phone calls with a legal aid attorney who was patient and honest with us about what our options were. Immigration proceedings have their own pace and their own logic, and that logic did not bend to our urgency or our circumstances. The attorney reviewed our case and told us, plainly and without cruelty, that our situation had limited pathways. We had entered legally, We had violated the conditions of our visa by working. We had no employer sponsorship, no family petition, no pending application that would create a legal basis for extended stay. The most likely outcome, she said, was a voluntary departure agreement or a formal removal order. Mira was released to my custody within 72 hours, pending our appearance date. When I saw her walk out of the facility, I held her for a long time in the parking lot without speaking. She was thinner than when I had last seen her. Her eyes were tired in a way that sleep alone could not fix. But she was composed. She asked me how I was doing. She asked about Vikram and Sonal. She asked if I had eaten properly. That was Mira. Even then, we had 1 month before our scheduled appearance. We spent it in a strange, suspended state, continuing to exist inside the apartment, continuing to talk with Vikram and Sonal and Dinesh and Kavita, continuing to eat and sleep and move through the days, while knowing that a clock was running down underneath all of it. I did not return to the landscaping job. Mira did not return to the motel. We lived carefully off what remained of our savings, which by then had shrunk to an amount that felt both inadequate and almost irrelevant given what was coming. We went to our appearance. The attorney accompanied us. The proceeding was brief and administrative in a way that felt entirely disproportionate to what it meant for our lives. At the end of it, we signed a voluntary departure agreement. We were given a date by which we had to leave the United States. 30 days. I called my parents that evening from the apartment. My father answered. I told him what had happened and what was coming. There was a silence on the line that lasted several seconds before he spoke. He said, "Come home, son. Just come home." His voice was the voice of a man who had been quietly afraid for 7 months and was now, in the most painful way possible, relieved. Mira called her sister in Vadodara. I sat near her while she made the call, not listening to the words but watching her face. At one point, her composure finally broke, just briefly, just for a moment, and she pressed her hand over her eyes, and her shoulders dropped, and she let out a single quiet breath that carried everything she had been holding for months. Then she straightened, wiped her face, and continued the conversation. I looked away because watching her cry felt like witnessing something too private even for me. We had 30 days. We spent them settling what could be settled, returning borrowed items, saying goodbyes, helping Vikram and Sonal with a few things around the apartment as a small gesture of gratitude for their generosity. Dinesh and Kavita, who were still navigating their own situation, embraced us at the door on the morning we left. Dinesh pressed my hand and said, "Brother, I hope things are easier for you back home." I told him I hoped the same for him. The flight home was a mirror image of the flight out. The long hours over the ocean, the gradual approach to India, the familiar skyline of Mumbai appearing below the clouds. But everything else was different. We were not two people moving towards something. We were two people returning to a life we had dismantled with our own hands. When we landed in Ahmedabad, Mira's sister was at the airport with her husband. My parents were there too. My mother embraced Mira first, then me, and held on longer than usual. Nobody said much. There was nothing to say that the situation had not already said for itself. We had no house to return to. Our savings were nearly gone. The flight alone had taken a significant portion of what remained. We moved into the spare room at Mira's sister's home in Vadodara, where we lived for the next several months while we slowly, carefully began the process of rebuilding. I found work through an old contact in the auto parts industry, not at my family's shop, which had been closed during the time we were gone, but at a larger distributor in the city who needed someone with my experience. The pay was modest. The work was familiar. Every morning I went in and did the job and came home, and slowly the familiarity of it began to feel less like failure and more like ground. Mira began tutoring again within a few months. A neighbor's child, then 2 more, then a small group meeting at the kitchen table of the house her sister had helped us rent, a small 1-bedroom apartment not far from where we used to live. Nothing grand, but ours. 7 months. That was how long the American dream lasted for us. 7 months, 2 jobs each, 1 detention, 1 court appearance, and a voluntary departure. We lost our house, Mira's jewelry, our savings, and a 1.5 years of stability before and after the journey. We came back with 2 large suitcases, significantly less money than we left with, and a knowledge of ourselves that we had not possessed before. I do not tell this story to discourage anyone from dreaming. I tell it because the dream deserves honesty, because the gap between what we imagine and what we find can be very wide, and crossing it without preparation can cost more than money. It can cost you the life you already had, and sometimes, only when it is gone, Do you understand how much it was worth?